Welcome everyone to another installment of Philosopher Meets Critics, organized by the Federal University of Bahia and by Concept, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition. Today, we are happy to have Christoph Kelp here with us, who is a philosopher at the University of Glasgow, where he's also the director of the Cogito Epistemology Research Center. Chris has a new forthcoming book in epistemology. The book is entitled Inquiry, Knowledge, and Understanding, and it will serve as the theme of today's discussion. So welcome, Christoph. Joining us today, we of course also have three critics. So welcome to Giada Fratantonio from the University of Edinburgh. Welcome to Paul Silva, who is a member of Concept at the University of Cologne. And welcome to Felipe Rocha from the Federal University of Bahia. It's great to have you all here. So to start us off, we will first have a presentation of the ideas in the book by Christoph himself, after which we will allow our three critics to give their comments. So without further ado, I propose that we dive into Christoph's presentation.
All right, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this. It's really exciting to be here. I've been looking forward to this session for quite some time now. And in particular, I wanted to thank my commentators for taking the time to read this book and preparing some comments that some of which I already know to be very thoughtful and great, and others I'm pretty sure I'll find out in a very short period of time that they are all the same, just as wonderful and great. So I'm going to start with a brief overview over the book. Okay, this is going to be relatively short, I guess. I need to share my screen again, I suppose. Okay, so my plan is to just talk a little bit about what's happening in the book at a sort of very general level. Like, I'm not going to get into any arguments or any such, just kind of presenting what the book's about. So here's the overview over the book that also corresponds to basically the chapter structure. Introduction, chapter on the aim of inquiry, chapter on the nature of knowledge, chapter on conditions of knowledge, a chapter on understanding, one on epistemic value, and one on skepticism. Okay, and I'm gonna sort of walk you through this and tell you, like, you know, with a very broad brush, what's happening in the book in each of these chapters. Okay, so for the introduction, basically the central idea is to bring to the table a kind of new methodological idea, which is kind of the key move in the book, which is to take inquiry as the starting point for epistemological theorizing. So that is really what I call the central methodological idea. And what the book tries to do is to develop that idea in some detail. Okay, and then the central aim is to argue that this idea allows us to develop an attractive way of doing epistemology and like to begin to fill in the details. And more specifically, what the details that I try to provide is I try to develop a novel account of some core epistemic phenomena, in particular knowledge and understanding. I try my hand at a novel account of epistemic value and a kind of novel solution to the problem of skepticism as well. So you can see the ambitions are, you know, quite substantive. So I try to do a lot of stuff. And the idea is, you know, to the extent that the results are good, it will vindicate the methodological idea, right? So the idea gives us good results, and that's why we should take it seriously. Okay, so another way of homing into what this idea amounts to is maybe by contrasting it with some alternatives that we can find in the literature, right? So there's a kind of traditional view where I take inquiry as the starting point for epistemological theorizing. The traditional view takes maybe true belief and false belief, that distinction, as the starting point for epistemological theorizing, right? So that's something that you find in reliabilism, right? Reliabilism starts with true belief as like a starting point, and then tells us what reliable processes are as processes that tend to produce true beliefs, and then tells us what justified belief is, and ultimately wants to tell us what knowledge is, and so on, right? Everything going back ultimately to true belief, right? Very explicit, I guess, in Goldman's kind of veritist epistemology. And then something that is an alternative to traditionalism is knowledge first epistemology, most closely associated with Williamson's work. And Williamson abandons this idea of starting epistemological theorizing with the distinction between true belief and false belief. He instead wants to start with the distinction between knowledge and ignorance. Okay, and my book, in contrast, tries to start with inquiry, and then in particular, as we'll see in a moment, tries to think about the aim of inquiry and so on. And we can see that it's an alternative, because depending on what the aim of inquiry turns out to be, right, it comes out siding more with traditionalism or with knowledge first epistemology. So for instance, if the aim of inquiry it turns out to be true belief, then, like, you know, this kind of view gives you something that's closer to traditionalism. If the aim of inquiry turns out to be knowledge, then it gives you something that's closer to knowledge first epistemology, but it leaves that issue open, which is why it's a kind of distinct methodological approach, distinct to these two more familiar alternatives. Okay, so then in the first chapter, I talk about the aim of inquiry, and something that's of some importance in the book is that I distinguish between two types of inquiry. So you can inquire into specific questions, and in the book and also here, I'm focusing even more specifically on specific whether questions. So the question whether there's milk in the fridge, question whether Biden won the election, and so on, right? And at the same time, you can also inquire into more general phenomena, where a general phenomenon is something like the evolution of mankind, or the rise of the Roman Empire, right? So those are general phenomena. Okay, and so so inquiry is an activity with an aim, and indeed with a constitutive aim and also constitutive norms. But for present purposes, I'm going to be focusing on constitutive aims, which are the most important feature for present purposes. Okay, and so the thought is we can start with some characterization of these constitutive aims that are quite lightweight, right? Inquiry into a specific whether question, into the question whether Biden won the election, that aims at settling the question whether Biden won the election. And inquiry into a general phenomenon like the rise of the Roman Empire, that aims at understanding that phenomenon, understanding the rise of the Roman Empire. And the thought that these aims are constitutive aims of inquiry means that inquiry is a type of activity that necessarily has these aims. So if what you're doing doesn't aim at settling a certain question, right, then it's not inquiry into a specific question. If your inquiry doesn't aim at understanding a certain phenomenon, then it's not inquiry into a certain phenomenon. Okay, so with these lightweight characterizations of the aim of inquiry in place, right? In the first chapter, I talk a lot about the aim of inquiry into specific questions, specific whether questions, and I look into epistemologically more substantive theses about that aim, right? So in a lightweight manner, we can say inquiry into whether there's a table here aims at settling the question whether there's a table here. But more substantively, right, and if you look at the epistemological literature, then you see that there are a bunch of views that are defended in that literature on the aim of inquiry, including that inquiry into whether P aims at knowledge whether P, that it aims at true belief on whether P, and that it aims on justified belief on whether P. I mean, those are, I think, the main candidates for inquiry into specific whether questions. And what the first chapter of the book does is it tries to offer a kind of a systematic defense of the view that knowledge is indeed the aim of inquiry into specific whether questions, right? And then at the end, as you read through it, you can also see that in addition, there is an argument that if this is correct, right, then we should not expect knowledge to admit of a certain kind of analysis, which is a reductive analysis in terms of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions that have explanatory priority in terms of justified true belief. Okay, that's a result that we can defend once we've defended the view that knowledge is the aim of inquiry in conjunction with some further assumptions that are partially defended later in the book and partially are independently plausible. Okay, so that's the first chapter on the aim of inquiry. And so then at the end, this kind of idea that a certain kind of analysis that has been very popular in the epistemological literature is not going to be an option for us, right? So, but of course, the fact that we don't want a certain kind of analysis, right? A reductive analysis or dismantling analysis for knowledge doesn't mean that, you know, we can now lay the question of about the nature of knowledge to rest, right? So we need to say something about it. What is knowledge by its very nature? And to answer that question or to address it, that's the task of chapter 2. And the key move is to distinguish between two types of analyses that can be found in Strawson. So one is a dismantling analysis, right? There we have a complex structure and we try to break it down into simpler elements such that we can understand the nature of the complex structure in terms of the simpler elements which we have independently understood, right? And most of what's happening in the post-Gettier and literature is that kind of analysis, right? So the justified true belief view of knowledge is a dismantling analysis. So knowledge is a complex structure that breaks down into justification, truth, and belief, right? And to understand the nature of knowledge, we need to understand, according to this view, that knowledge is justified true belief. Okay, and so if the argument at the end of the first chapter is right, then this kind of thing can't work. And you know, there's the familiar inductive kind of argument that none of the attempts to make this kind of analysis work has worked throughout the 20th and beginning of 21st century, even though we've tried really hard. So maybe we need something else. And Strawson offers a different type of analysis, which I don't know whether he calls it that, but I certainly call it that, network analysis, where the idea of a network analysis is to have an analysis whereby a bunch of phenomena can only be understood, analyzed in terms of their relations to one another, right? So we don't think of something as a complex that we break down into simpler elements, but we think of something as part of a broader structure, and to understand its nature, we need to understand its place in the structure. Okay, so then, of course, unsurprisingly, the thought is, well, I want to give a network analysis of knowledge, so understand the nature of knowledge in terms of its place in a broader structure, and to do that, I argue that there are certain activities with constitutive aims and norms for which it's independently plausible that they do not admit of a dismantling analysis, but that they call for a network analysis. where the various phenomena are constitutively related to one another and can only be understood in terms of each other. So chess and baseball are instances here, right? So chess, you might say, well, the constitutive aim of chess is to checkmate your opponent. Well, we can actually give necessary and sufficient conditions for checkmating your opponent, i.e. placing the king under inescapable threat of capture, right? And you might say, well, don't we have a dismantling analysis now? And the answer is no, because to give a dismantling analysis, we need to continue with the dismantling analysis until we reach only simple elements, right? But we can sort of still ask questions about what a king is and so on. But then again, we can't understand what a king is if we don't understand that it's a type of piece in a game of chess. And now we need the notion of chess to understand what a king is, but we needed to the notion of a king to understand what chess is. So we have something circular, and that doesn't fit well with dismantling analysis, right? And the argument is, but at the same time, right, the thought is that we can still understand, what chess is, what checkmating is, what a king is in terms of a network analysis, right? We have this chess structure, and we understand the various elements of it in terms of each other, and the whole thing in terms of its elements, okay? And then the next step is to argue that inquiry falls into that class. And in particular, so inquiry is an activity with constitutive aims and norms, and that doesn't admit of dismantling analysis, but calls for network analysis. And in particular, inquiry, and then knowledge as its aim, and belief as a kind of move, as we might think of it, or the result of a kind of move in inquiry, they're constitutively related to one another and can only be understood in terms of each other, right? So inquiry, you might say, is the sort of activity that aims at knowledge, and such that belief is a type of move, or the result of a type of move in it. Knowledge is the constitutive aim of inquiry, and belief is the result of a type of move in inquiry that aims at knowledge, right? So we characterize all of these phenomena in terms of each other, right? And try to understand what they are in terms of their place in this broader structure, rather than trying to give like a dismantling analysis where we think of it as a complex that we break down into simpler elements. And this is the kind of new non-reductive analysis of knowledge that the book develops. Okay, so chapter 3 is then on conditions on knowledge. So that connects the inquiry-centric approach to epistemological theorizing with some earlier work on the roles of abilities to know in epistemology. So that's developed in some detail in an earlier book called Good Thinking, right? And basically this chapter just says, I still like most of what I said in that other book. And here's how I can have those ideas within this new framework, how this new framework can be connected to the earlier work, right? So there's some noteworthy modifications. I am now less sanguine that I want this to be a kind of virtue epistemological theory, which now is quite closely associated with this theory of performance normativity, where you assess performances or attempts in terms of success, competence, and aptness, where this gives you your background theory. So I'm a little less sanguine about that. I think that might not be quite right. And similarly, in the earlier work, I thought of the view as a kind of knowledge first view, but I think that this inquiry-based view is an alternative to knowledge first. And so now I also don't think of it really as a knowledge first view anymore. So there's some modifications, but this stuff is already out there. So maybe one of the less novel bits of the book, minus the modifications. Okay, that's what's happening in chapter 3. And the reason, one of the main reasons I bring this in is that I need it for my discussion of transmission of knowledge under competent deduction and skepticism later on in the book. Okay, so then chapter 4 turns to understanding, and the idea that inquiry into general phenomena constitutively aims at understanding. Again, I've done some earlier work on understanding that unpacks understanding in terms of systematic knowledge. So very roughly, the idea, the sort of guiding intuition is, if you know everything there is to know about the world, then you understand everything there is to understand about the world, right? So this is very rough and needs some sort of modification to be plausible, but that's sort of the intuition, the intuitively plausible thought. And then so the thought is like maximal understanding is maximal knowledge. And then you can measure degrees of understanding in terms of distances from this maximum point of knowledge, and you have attributions of outright understanding. You'll have a contextualist semantics for that, where context gives you a threshold of what it is to be close enough to maximal knowledge to count as understanding a phenomenon in context. Okay, and so one important modification that happens in this book is, I mean, it looks kind of like a reductive analysis of understanding when you look at it, but I'm now kind of convinced that, again, we want this to be a non-reductive view, right, whereby inquiry into general phenomena, understanding of general phenomena, and views of phenomena, where views are roughly the connected beliefs that you have about them, right? They're constitutively related in a way that parallels the inquiry into specific questions, knowledge, and beliefs in the case of inquiry into specific questions. So they're in a parallel way constitutive related and can only be understood in terms of each other. So in this way, chapter 4 develops this kind of view as a non-reductive account of understanding. Okay, so epistemic value. There, the key idea is, or one key idea is that activities with constitutive aims constitute value domains in which the constitutive aims are final values of, for their own sake, values relative to those domains, right? So chess, right, the activity of chess, they constitute a value domain of chess in which the constitutive aim, so checkmating, is something that's valuable for its own sake relative to that domain. Okay, and if you buy this kind of view, and you buy the sort of things that I say about inquiry, right, that there are two kinds, and that they constitutively aim at respectively knowledge and understanding, then you can derive a view about, like, you know, what's finally valuable in the domains that are constituted by these activities, right? And knowledge comes out as a final value in the domain that's constituted by inquiry into specific questions, and understanding comes out as the final value in the domain constituted by inquiry into general phenomena. And the thought then is basically that these two activities, they're related in a certain way, right? So if you think about it, if you want to understand something, right, you want to understand the rise of the Roman Empire, and what you'll do is you'll, like, you know, ask a bunch of questions about it, right? And maybe you read a book, and as you read the book, you know, a lot of questions that were open to you get closed, right, as you go through the book. So the thought is that understanding into general phenomena is sort of something that happens through, inquiry into general phenomena is something that happens through inquiry into specific questions, right? So you have a kind of relation that is not dissimilar to the relation between, like, a point in a tennis match and a match in a tennis match, right? So the way in which you win a match is by winning a bunch of points. And the thought is likewise, right? The way in which you get the final value of inquiry into general phenomena. So understanding is through scoring points in inquiry into specific questions, acquiring a bunch of knowledge, and then you got to do something with it as well, right? And the thought is that basically the domain that's constituted by inquiry into general phenomena is the epistemic domain. And so we have what we get is a view of epistemic value, well, that comes with a view of the boundaries and the structure of the epistemic domain, which is sort of, given by inquiry, and more generally as an instance of an activity with a constitutive aim, and we get a picture on which we have a kind of epistemic pluralism or value pluralism that drops out of it, where knowledge and understanding are both final epistemic values. And then I argue that if you have this kind of view, then you can solve a bunch of value problems, including why knowledge is more valuable than any proper subset of its parts, right? Because knowledge is the final value, and the proper subsets of the parts of knowledge, if you think that there's such a thing, isn't. To take just one example. Okay, so then the last chapter is on skepticism. So I've put down the infamous argument from ignorance here. I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. If I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, then I don't know that I have hands. Hence, I don't know I have hands, right? Both premises look quite plausible. Second premise is motivated by the plausible transmission principle for knowledge. So knowledge transmits across competent deduction. If I know something, I competently deduce something else from that thing that I know and come to believe that something else. Based on this deduction, then I know that that's something else, right? If you have that kind of principle, then 2 is looking very, very attractive. Okay, so both premises look good, right? I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. How could I? I couldn't tell the difference between being a brain in a vat and not being a brain in a vat. Second premise, motivated by the transmission principle. So both look good, but if they're both true, then we get the very implausible result that, like, I don't even know that I have hands, right? So, so I take this to be the perhaps strongest argument for skepticism, and that's the one that I engage with in this last chapter, right? And typically, if you look at approaches to skepticism, you get people who deny the first premise. So they say, I do know that I'm not a brain in a vat, right? And I know it maybe because I know that I have hands, and I can deduce that I'm not a brain in a vat from the known fact that I have hands, right? That's the kind of Morean line, right? So they deny premise 1, hold on to premise 2, and the denial of the conclusion, right? And then there are others. This is the sort of Dretske-Nozick camp who hold on to 1 and 3, but deny 2, or at least the transmission principle that motivates it, right? And this is kind of something that's associated with a sensitivity-based approach to knowledge quite often. Okay, and so the way in which my view differs from these standard views is that I reject both the first premise and the transmission principle motivating the second premise, right? So I want to say that Moore is right in that we can know that we're not brains in vats, but Dretske and Nozick were also right that we can't know it by deducing it from things like I have hands, right? That's not how we know it, even if we know that we've hands, right? And this means that I'm now facing 2 important challenges, right? One concerns how one might restrict the transmission principle, right? Even if I can't come to know that I'm not a brain in a vat based on knowing that I have hands, based on competent deduction from that. It looks as though I can know a lot of stuff based on competent deduction from what I know, right? I can know that like, this thing here before me is a piece of furniture by deducing that from the fact that I know that it's a table, right? And that being a table entails being a piece of furniture, right? So one thing that needs to happen is to explain how it can be that deduction like transmits knowledge in some cases, but not in other cases. And one thing that that chapter does is develop an account of that. And the other thing that we need to do is, of course, to explain how it is that we could possibly know that we're not brains and vats, given that we can't know it based on deduction from things like that we have hands, right? So one of the things that are good once you have the closure principle, or the transmission principle, is that you can explain how it is that we might know that we're not brains and vats, because like this principle is a way of doing this. And my alternative, which I always thought was so crazy that nobody would ever even give it a thought, but when I've presented this, I found surprisingly resistance, maybe that will change today, was that basically we have these abilities, like recognitional abilities to, so abilities to recognize that certain possibilities couldn't easily obtain, right? And we kind of have basic knowledge that we're not brains and vats based on, as a result of these abilities to know that certain possibilities couldn't easily obtain. Okay, so that's a very quick overview over the book. And I guess at this stage, I stop sharing my screen and I say thank you. And I hand over to the next person. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for that very clear summary. We will now move on to our critics. And Giada, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks, Chris, for giving me the chance to read the book in advance. It was really interesting. And I have to say, I was sympathetic with most of the things, especially as someone sympathetic to anti-reductionist epistemology, knowledge-first epistemology, the knowledge normal belief. So I thought the book was a really interesting way of showing how we can do anti-reductionist epistemology in novel ways. So hopefully, I think it's going to move forward the debate on this kind of new way of approaching epistemology, but in a way that is not only the knowledge-first approach. So what I want to do today, I thought I would like to suggest a potential dilemma for Chris inquiry-first epistemology. And a full disclosure, as I said, I'm very sympathetic with what you say, and I don't think what I'm going to say should be seen really as a knockdown objection to reviews, but hopefully I can like flag some potential issue and some topics that I'd like to hear a bit more about. So my starting point is this very broad question, which is what is the nature of inquiry? And I think, well, Chris does talk about inquiry as he just said, as an activity with a constitutive aim. But what I was thinking is, okay, but what should we expect inquiry to look like, so to speak? And so I started thinking, okay, well, on the one hand, a very intuitive way, I think, that we can think of inquiry is as a kind of an evidentialist way of thinking about inquiry. So collecting evidence towards a specific proposition or something. But I think this is probably too restrictive notion. And that definitely doesn't seem to be the only way in which Chris wants to think about inquiry. So I don't think this is a very charitable view. So I'm going to put it aside. So one way would be instead to say, well, inquiry perhaps involves some sort of psychological attitude or phenomenology. And here, I'm not very specific here, but what I'm thinking about, for instance, is being curious, being open-minded, attention, for instance, or even desire to close a question. And so my thought is, well, if inquiry does involve this sort of psychological attitude, then it seems to me that this notion of inquiry might clash with Kelp's network analysis. On the other hand, what Chris could say is, no, inquiry doesn't really involve this specific psychological attitude. And if I understood it correctly, it seems to me that, in fact, Chris's view is more in line with the second way of thinking about inquiry. So inquiry is much broader activity And if this is the case, then the other worry is that it's not perhaps so clear as I'd like it to be that inquiry should go first. And so my question is, well, can knowledge do the same job as inquiry if inquiry is this kind of very broad notion? So I'm just going to say quickly a couple of things about both horns of the dilemma. So first of all, network analysis, I'm not going to repeat myself. Chris already talked about this, but very briefly, the idea is, okay, we want to give an analysis that is an alternative to dismantling analysis. And I really enjoyed this part of the book, by the way. And the idea is that we can understand the different epistemic components of our epistemic domain in relation to, we should understand them in relation to each other. And in particular, taking inquiry first is going to have some benefits. So what we do, well, it means that knowledge is going to be seen as the constitutive aim of inquiry, and that's how we can understand it. And at the same time, belief can be understood always in relation to inquiry, in the sense that one believes that P or not P, if and only if inquiry into whether P, into whether a proposition is closed for one in the affirmative or negative. So here I'm focusing specifically on inquiring into a specific question, a specific proposition. So what I like to focus on is the belief claim. So again, we can think, okay, inquiry perhaps involves some psychological attitude, like open-mindedness and so on. And here one worry is that if this is so, then inquiry seems to clash with belief. And this is not really anything new. I think Chris himself anticipates a similar objection, because belief basically has the consequence that every belief is the result of an inquiry. And so this is the objection that Chris calls, I think, that's not inquiry objection. What he does is he considers automatic belief, case of automatic belief. So you consider this case where you enter a red house and you automatically form the belief that the house is red. So the objection, roughly put, is supposed to be, look, there are some cases where we do form beliefs automatically, and yet it seems like we're not conducting an inquiry. So that seems to clash with belief. And if I understood Chris correctly, his response here is, no, look, if you have formed the belief, then there is a sense in which you have made a move in the inquiry. Perhaps you try to find out how things look like and so on. So here I'm not entirely sure about this case. I mean, one worry that I have is that in order to make sense of automatic belief cases, then we really have to give up on this notion that inquiry does involve some psychological attitude. But so even if we put aside the automatic belief case, in general, I was wondering if you, Chris, could say a bit more about cases of unconscious beliefs. So if inquiry does involve this psychological attitude of open-mindedness, curiosity, and so on, then how can we account for the fact that allegedly we do process beliefs constantly, many beliefs at the subconscious level? So yeah, this is just something that I'd like to hear a bit more about. I mean, one quick fix here, one quick solution would, of course, be restricting belief to conscious propositions only. And this, I think, the conscious beliefs, sorry, only. This, if I remember correctly, is something that Jane Friedman is more sympathetic with. And so the idea here would be that it's every conscious belief that is the result of an inquiry. But then again, I wonder about cases of wishful thinking, right? So if I believe that coronavirus is going to be not a problem in 2 weeks, but I don't conduct any inquiry. In fact, I don't have any curiosity about whether that's really the case. I just want to believe that. Then we do hold a belief consciously, but that's not the result of an inquiry. So I want to deal with these cases. So let's go back to the original claim, the belief claim. So there is another consequence of this claim, which is not only every belief is the result of an inquiry, but every belief is the result of a closed inquiry. What this means, if I understood it correctly, is that if one believes that P or not P, then one does not continue to inquiry into whether P or not P. And again, there is a potential objection here that Chris himself already anticipates in the book, which is the belief does not close inquiry objection. And the idea here would be, well, there seem to be cases where we have beliefs about things, but we keep inquiring into whether these things are true or false. And here I really like what Chris says, which is, well, what's happening in these cases is that we're actually, if we do believe the P, we're actually inquiring into whether a P-related proposition is true. So it's completely consistent with Chris's view that we hold a belief, and if we keep inquiring into whether a proposition that is related to P or that is similar to P is true. And so the problem doesn't arise. And what I'd like to do now very briefly is to suggest a case where it seems to me actually that we do believe that P, and we keep inquiring into whether P is true. And the cases that I was thinking about that I'm kind of fascinated by are cases in which we want to find out what we really believe. And so case of introspection. So assume B is I believe that, and P is proposition like eating meat is impermissible. I take this kind of proposition because I think that these interesting cases are more striking when we consider propositions that are a bit more controversial or propositions about morality. And so I assume that I start with believing that I believe that eating meat is morally permissible, vegetarian for a long time, and I'm like, of course I believe that. But then I ask myself, well, do I really believe that eating meat is impermissible? Perhaps I actually could explain my action differently. Perhaps I want to impress my peers, or perhaps, you know, I've been vegetarian for a long time and now it's just my second nature, but I don't really believe that eating meat is impermissible. So it seems like I could inquiring into whether I really believe that P. And so we would have a straightforward counterexample here. I don't think this is a very good objection. I think there are many ways in which Chris could overcome very easily this objection. One way, for instance, would be to say that the way I'm describing the case is wrong. And so what I should say is, I start off with I believe that P, and then I ask myself, do I really believe that P? And then what I do is really not really inquiring into whether I believe that P, but I'm inquiring into whether the proposition is true. So I'm thinking, do I really believe that eating meat is impermissible? Well, I'm attending to the proposition itself. That kind of take it with a pinch of salt, but it kind of reminded me a bit of Evans' transparency claim. So I kind of attend outward to the proposition. And so in this case, I would have a case where I believe that P, but I inquire into I believe the P related proposition. And so there's no counterexample once again. And here, I'm not really sure what to think about this case, but my suspicion is that whether this is a counterexample or not is going to depend on the details of the case. So again, I think there are different ways of, you know, making sense of this case, but I'd like to hear what you please think about it. For instance, assume that at the end of the inquiry, I find out that eating meat is impermissible. It seems to me that in this case, I found out that eating meat is impermissible, but I also plausibly find out that I believe that eating meat is impermissible. And in fact, I can tell myself, oh yeah, of course, I was right. I believe that eating meat is morally impermissible. I believe that all along. I don't know why I doubt it, right? And so in this case, again, it seems like what's happened is that we did believe that P, and we kept inquiring into P. So even when we shift the attention to a believe that P related proposition, we might have counterexamples. Again, I think there might be ways, perhaps it could appeal to conscious versus unconscious propositions, beliefs, once again, or to the idea that instead here, I don't really believe that I believe the P, but I have a high credence at P. But again, I'm just curious to hear what you think about it. One way would be to just say, look, we should think about this constraint in normative terms. So we should say, again, I think Friedman makes this point, if one inquires into whether P is the case, then one should suspend judgment on whether P is the case. So you shouldn't believe that. And here I just want to say two things. The first thing is that I wonder whether this is something that Chris wants to do, because belief as you presented is a descriptive claim. So I wonder whether you'd be happy with this claim or what consequences it has on your framework. But more importantly, I worry that this wouldn't help because I think that it seems to me that it's both psychologically plausible and normatively permissible in some cases to inquiry into whether P is the case while believing that P, until or unless I find out some counter evidence. And the cases I have in mind, for instance, are cases where I conduct a logical proof and I prove that P, and then I just want to double check whether I did everything correctly. And so I go through every single step of the proof. And it seems plausible to me to say that it's okay to keep believing that P, but of course I'm just double checking almost, like I know that the right thing to do is to double check every single exercise. And unless I find some mistake, I'm just going to retain my belief that P. So again, this is just one more case that I'm curious to hear what you think about. Now, to conclude, I very briefly what I've done so far. So I started asking, what is the nature of inquiry? And I started suggesting, well, perhaps inquiry does involve some specific psychological attitude, like being curious about the answer of a question, attention, and so on. But if this is the case, then it seems to clash with a key tenet of Kelp's network analysis, in particular belief. So the other option would be to say that inquiry doesn't involve this psychological attitude, and this is the last horn of the second horn of the dilemma that I'd like to very briefly consider now. So we can say, okay, inquiry doesn't involve any specific psychological attitude, right? Now, my worry here is that it's not then so clear to me why should inquiry define the contours of the epistemic domain rather than knowledge or belief like formation, like belief forming attitudes more generally. And here I think is a very plausible answer that you, Chris, could give, which is, as you just said before, well, here's why, because knowledge as well as understanding are central epistemic values. And we said that inquiry aims both at knowledge and understanding, depending whether it's an inquiring into proposition or into phenomenon. And so the idea here would be, look, having an epistemological theory that puts inquiry first gives us a framework that has much more explanatory power. So it seems right to me to say that inquiry should go first. The only worry that I have here is that this seems to be a plausible answer to me, only as long as understanding cannot be reduced to knowledge of specific propositions. And I mean, as you said, you have a whole chapter on understanding, and I definitely cannot do justice to all the arguments that you put forward in the book. But if I got it correctly, the idea is that understanding requires maximally connected knowledge, so knowledge of the explanatory relationships between propositions, perhaps. And so I still struggle to see why it's not the case that understanding is not reducible to knowledge of more specific propositions. Or maybe I just I didn't get this right, in which case I apologize. But so yeah, the idea is that if it is possible to reduce understanding to knowledge of specific propositions, then it seems we lose the kind of motivation for putting inquiry first. At least this kind of motivation. There definitely, your book, I think, provides other motivations to do so. But yeah, I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Giada, for your thoughtful comments and for taking the time to read this book. So I'm looking at a dilemma. Either I understand inquiry as involving a kind of psychological attitude, but then this kind of account of belief that I'm working with is in trouble, or I go with something more relaxed, but then it's sort of a little unclear why I should go with inquiry, as an inquiry-centric view rather than a knowledge-first view. Okay, and so I think that Giada really puts her finger on a really interesting issue here. The nature of inquiry is like, I don't really say very much about that throughout the book, other than that it constitutively aims at knowledge and or understanding. I consider, as Giada also already pointed out, a bunch of objections, but basically my attempt is to diffuse the objections and try to remain as neutral as possible on the nature of inquiry. Okay, so I'm going to try and do that now as well. I should begin by saying that, like, if I have to go for one of the two horns, I'm much more attracted to the second horn than the first one. I mean, basically, I think that, you know, I mean, inquiry behaves like chess and so on, right? I mean, I'm not sure that you need psychological attitudes to, you know, describe what's essential to chess or inquiry for that matter. But I thought it would be good to engage with some of your really interesting points that you made, and especially these cases which are really cool. So the first thing is, I mean, I have this belief, this view according to which that you put on the slides, one believes that P or not P, if and only if inquiry into whether P is closed for one in the affirmative or negative, right? And then you suggest that there is some consequences of this kind of view. I mean, in the notes you sent me, and I think also on the slides you mentioned two. One is that if one believes, then one does not continue to inquire into whether P. And the other one is, if one believes P, then one has conducted and closed an inquiry into whether P. Okay, so I want to start with a couple of observations about this. The first is may become relevant later. We'll see how much time I have. So the first is, the first consequence, if one believes that P, then one doesn't continue to inquire into whether P. That is, I think, roughly true. But it is true, of course, only so long as one continues to believe that P, right? It might be that, you know, you forget or your belief is lost or something like that. And then, of course, you can inquire. I mean, of course, that's sort of entailed by what's stated here, but it's kind of worth keeping in mind, maybe for later when we think about inquiry. About specific cases more. Okay, the second consequence, if one believes that P, then one has conducted and closed an inquiry into whether P. I'm not so sure whether I need to take this on board, right? I mean, so what I was thinking of here, suppose, like, you know, a certain path may be closed for me, right? Maybe there's maybe a landslide has closed it or something like that, right? And now it's closed for me, but that doesn't mean that I have conducted some sort of closing procedure and have closed it myself, right? It's possible that the path is closed for me now as a result of some other things that have happened, maybe a landslide or something like that, right? And I mean, it seems to me that I could have a view that is kind of in relevant respect similar about belief, right? So the view about belief just says that inquiry into whether P is closed for you, but it leaves open how it's closed, right? I mean, in particular, it leaves open whether it's closed through a sort of closing procedure that we might call inquiry, in which I close it, or maybe through some other things, just some sort of cognitive processes running, right, in my brain, and as a result, the question is now closed for me. And if you have that kind of view, then you might be able to deal with the sort of the unconscious and automatic beliefs, right? So now running the processes that lead to them, right? They might close certain questions for us and in this way generate beliefs for us, even if we don't think of what's happening there as instances of inquiry. Compatibly with that, the belief might still be defined in terms of inquiry as the question being closed for you, right? So those things seem to me to be compatible. And with wishful thinking, similarly, right? What is interesting about wishful thinking, I guess, is that you can still assess wishful thinking as in some way negative, and I think the framework will give you that, because the resulting beliefs are still constitutively aimed at knowledge, right? And the fact that we have wishful thinking still means that there is no knowledge, so these beliefs fall short. And more generally, the kind of view of abilities and so on will give you the result that the processes are problematic as well. Okay. Okay, so those are sort of the cases you sort of more broadly, the phenomena that you worried about, rightly so. And then there were two more specific cases that you considered me restricting the view to first or to conscious belief, and these cases might still come to bite me. So the first is where I have a higher order belief, and then I ask myself, do I really believe this thing? And then I conduct some inquiries, like, I ask myself, do I believe that? Is it correct? Would I act on it? I launch an inquiry. I found out that I do really. Okay, so so here is where the first observation might get some traction, right? I mean, it might be that you have a belief that you believe before you ask the question, but once you ask the question, somehow you lose your belief, right? And it might not even be that you should lose it, it's just that it so happens, right? Sort of your confidence is shaken or whatever, right? So, and your belief vanishes, and then you conduct your inquiry, and at the end of it, you regain it, right? I mean, I don't think that will work for every incarnation of the case. Probably one can describe the case in a way that circumvents this kind of move. But like, I mean, it's a thing one can throw at. I mean, I think what I would want to say about this case and also the proof case is that is that what you're really inquiring into is a slightly different question. I think that would be my sort of official strategy here, right? So, I mean, here's what I'm thinking, right? So suppose you ask yourself, you believe that P, and now you ask yourself, first, do I believe that P? And you think yes, and that's the end of it, right? And indeed, if you do believe that you believe that P, and like nothing happens to that belief, as you ask yourself the question, do I believe that P? That seems like the perfectly normal thing to happen. You just say, oh yeah, I do. Goodbye. So things, it seems to me, are slightly different when in this sort of situation you ask yourself, do I really believe that P? Right? Now it seems like, it seems considerably less natural to just say, yes, goodbye. And well, one thing that this suggests to me is that the question, do I believe that P? And do I really believe that P? Might be, I mean, when you ask them, you're really asking different questions, right? And questions like, do I really believe that P? Like, what you might be asking is something like whether you should believe that P. But another thing you might be asking, I mean, that is what we typically ask when we, or often ask when we ask other people, do you really believe that, right? Is, am I being honest with myself, right? Am I not rather engaging in some kind of elaborate self-deception and unexpected form of self-deception, right? And of course, like, if that's right, then it's perfectly compatible with my view that you believe that P all along, right? As you investigate the question, that you're effectively engaging in some kind of self-deception, right? You're just addressing a separate question. And one thing that can happen is that the result of this inquiry has bearing on your second order belief, right? If the answer comes out yes, then presumably if it's a good answer, like you know it at the end, you should revise your belief that you believe that that P or something like, well, I mean, or whatever, it couldn't have been true or whatever, right? So these sorts of cases, once we introduce the really, right, then I think you get really the case going, as opposed to when you just ask yourself, well, do I believe that is P among the things I believe, and you think yes, and then you move on in life, right? When you introduce the really, you get the motivation for not just like, brushing it aside with some quick reflection, but I also think you're kind of, what might be going on is that you're asking a slightly different question. Right, and I was thinking similarly for the natural deduction case, right? So you've described the case as follows: you have conducted a basic natural deduction, you've reached the conclusion that P. You now want to briefly double check that you have conducted the proof correctly. There seems nothing impermissible with going through the proof again, inquire into whether P, while keeping the belief that P, unless you find some errors, right? Now it seems to me that when you do the proof originally, right? So you're asking the question, is it the case that P, and then, or maybe can I prove that P or something like that, right? So that's the question you're pursuing, and once you have your proof, you've answered them, right? But now, what did you say? You want to briefly double check that you have corrected, that you have conducted the proof correctly, right? The question you're now asking is my proof correct? Is the proof that I have just given correct, right? And I guess the sort of idea that I would want to exploit here is that is a slightly different question, right? And I can pursue that question, is my proof correct? Whilst continuing to believe, at least in principle, right, compatibly with my account, that P is true, right? Even though, again, if I find out that my proof isn't correct, that should have some bearing on what I do with my belief subsequently, right? Those are things that are compatible. Okay, those are the sorts of things that came to mind on the first horn. And so now the second horn, about the difference between the inquiry-centric and the knowledge first view. And so there I have a kind of two-pronged approach, very briefly, right? So the thought is inquiry is a kind of, certainly inquiry into general phenomena is a complex kind of activity, right? Where you string together a bunch of simpler activities, right? You string together a bunch of asking a bunch of simpler questions, right? In much the same way in which playing a tennis match is a complex activity, right? You play a bunch of points, and as you play the points, you play the match, right? And so I think one of the reasons, so independently of the kind of more metaphysical stuff about reduction or not, I think there's an interesting normative thing happening, which is in the tennis case, right? You can't understand the success condition for winning the match just in terms of the success conditions for winning the point, right? In particular, it's possible in a tennis match that your opponent wins more points than you, and yet you win the match, right? So you lose all the games, you lose 2-0, and win all the games that you win by, only 1 point. Then it may be that your opponent has scored more points in the match than you, and yet you win the match, right? So whether you win the match is not just a question of scoring a certain number of points or scoring more points or something like that. It matters how the points that you score are related to one another, right? And I think that's why basically we need to think of winning the match and winning a point as two separate values, right? I mean, so basically we can't understand the value of the match simply in terms of the value of the points, and we can't understand the value of the point only in terms of the value of the match, right? Because, I mean, to say that you need to score points that are related in a certain way to one another doesn't really tell us anything yet about how we score points, for instance, right? So, so you can have these complex kind of activities, right? That where like we string simple activities together in a more complex one, and what you get is a situation where, as far as the complex activity is concerned, you want the success condition for the simpler activity to be something that's a final value, right? They give us how the points are, they tell us how the points are scored, and maybe other things don't tell us how points are scored, and so on, other activities. And the more complex thing also be a final value, which tells us when the whole thing is won, right? And the thought is that inquiry in a way behaves normatively like that, which is why we want them to be, you know, separate final values, which like, you know, that I take to be in a way sufficient for a kind of anti-knowledge first point. So that's the first prong. And the second one is the kind of goes back to an observation I made at the beginning, which is that the inquiry-based view leaves the question of like, you know, what the aim of inquiry is open, right? So it could be true belief, it could be knowledge. This is settled by argument, right? So whether we have something that's sort of closer to the traditionalist or closer to knowledge is left open by this kind of view, right? So we, in a way, create a playing field for the debate between those two views to play out, right? And I mean, in my view, it plays out in favor of something that's closer to the knowledge firsters. But as far as the general view is concerned, that point remains open, which is like, you know, why I think that it brings something to the table that's not, you know, completely covered by knowledge first in any case, even if you're right and the reduction works fine for understanding. So that's those are the thoughts that I had on this. So thanks again for your very thoughtful comments.
So Paul, you're up next.
All right, let me share my screen. So I really enjoyed your book, Chris, and I enjoy your work generally. So it was a real pleasure to be invited to participate in this event. And most of what I have to say today is just by way of clarification about your views within the book, and then your views within this book in regard to their compatibility with views in your other book, Good Thinking. And so let me just summarize what I take your thesis about the nature of knowledge to be, and then ask some clarifying questions and go from there. So you tell us about the nature of inquiry, and I haven't thought much about inquiry, and I felt myself really led along by what you had to say, you know, by way of defense of this thesis, that what it is to inquire, whether P is to engage in an activity that is aimed at settling the question, whether P. And your account of question settling was one I quite liked as well. Question settling is a matter of knowing. And then you go on to tell us about what you think knowledge is, the nature of knowledge. And this phrase, the nature of knowledge, is recurrent in connection with this. You know that P or not P, if and only if, inquiry into the question whether P is properly closed for one in the affirmative or negative. And this is, as you note, a circular account of the nature of knowledge because you characterize inquiry itself in terms of knowledge. So your account of knowledge invokes the very concept it's giving an account of. And so there's a circularity involved. Now, none of this is perhaps necessary to go through in any detail, but the idea that there are circular accounts of the nature of things is pretty familiar. Modal concepts are interdefined, and I don't know of any plausible reason to think that one of the concepts of necessity or possibility or contingency are more fundamental than the others. Possible world semantics has been invoked to explain modal claims, but again, the very notion of a possible world involves the notion of possibility. So again, we're in this circle, but it's an illuminating circle, and it's a theoretically virtuous one insofar as it helps us do better work and understand the nature of modality, and under some conception of the nature of modality. And lots of examples can be given. So I don't find the circularity involved in your account in any way problematic or eyebrow raising. What I'm wondering is what exactly you mean when you're talking about the nature of knowledge. So under one construal of the question, what is the nature of knowledge? You're asking something like this, what exactly is it for one to know that P? I'm calling this the essence question. I don't really know terribly much about the literature on essences. This is just a title for a question. So so don't read anything too particular into my use of the term essence. When you answer this question, what I'm calling the essence question, what you get is an instance of this, what it is for us to know that P is for blah. And when you get an answer to this, because of the identity claim, you do get a necessary biconditional. And circularity is okay here. And arguably, right, you get this for modal terms. And you get it in the case of knowledge on your account. To know P is just having properly settled the question in favor of P. But there's another kind of question that we want to know about, know the answer to, that also kind of goes under the heading, the nature of knowledge, and it's about grounding. In virtue of what exactly can S know that P? And the form of answers to this kind of question are different. It's this, necessarily S knows that P if and only if and because blah. And again, you get the necessary biconditional, the same, structurally the same kind of necessary biconditionals you do in the prior case with regard to answers to the essence question. Except you get a constraint here, an anti-circularity constraint, because grounding is an asymmetric relation. Circularity, at least of a direct sort, is not going to be proper. Or it's not going to be permissible in a true answer to this nature question. And given how you characterize knowledge in terms of properly closing inquiry and properly closing inquiry in terms of knowledge, it doesn't seem to me that your theory of knowledge is giving us an answer to the grounding question. And this is virtuous in a way, I think, and virtuous in the following way. Turns out that your account of knowledge in terms of giving an account of the essence question, if that's indeed what you're doing, so I'd like to hear more about that, is compatible with existing accounts of the nature of knowledge, at least construed as accounts of grounding, right? So you give a safety theoretic account of the nature of the grounds of knowledge, or a sensitivity theoretic, or a virtue theoretic. And as I began thinking more about the content of your other book and the collateral theses you commit yourself to and defend in this book, it does seem like you have at hand, readily at hand, the resources to answer the grounding question in terms of a knowledge first virtue theory of knowledge, the sort you defend in Good Thinking. So roughly it goes like this: S knows that P in certain circumstances of type C, if and only if S's way of coming to believe P in C manifests S's relevant ability to know in circumstances of that type. This is what you defend under a different name in Good Thinking. And it also seems to be virtually entailed by these other three theses that you defend in this book. And so because these will reemerge in just a moment, let me just state them for the benefit of everybody else. So on your account, justified belief is beliefs that are formed by an exercise of a relevant ability to know, roughly. You give more detail. You defend that both in Good Thinking and in the present volume. Manifestation is factive in the following sense. You manifest an ability to F, right? So hit a target only if you exercise an ability and that exercise succeeds. So manifestation of abilities guarantees the outcome of what that ability is an outcome for. And then you are on board with the pretty traditional idea that knowing entails justifiably believing. So KJ entailment. For the benefit of everybody, including Chris, I give a proof sketch of the relationship between this and KVEC, but we don't need to go through it now, but it is in the handout I sent around. And so this is kind of cool because on the one hand, you offer us what I think is most naturally construed as an answer to the essence question, but also you've got the resources to give us an answer to this grounding question. And so you're giving us, I think, the materials for a rather complete account of the nature of knowledge, which is quite nice. So my question for you is, am I right in interpreting you as I've presented you, or have I gone off the rails at some point? And is my way of sort of structuring your theses somehow mistaken? So there's no objection that I'm just searching for clarification. Now I want to raise an objection and propose a possible solution. I'm curious to see the extent to which, just whatever reaction you have to this. So the fundamental issue here stems from Chris's emphasis on dispositions being distinct from abilities. Abilities are a kind of disposition, but they're a kind of disposition with the relevant etiology. And he talks about this in more detail in his other book, Good Thinking, and I won't read the quote. I'll just tell you what my potentially misguided reading of that quote in that relevant section of his book involves. So he's taking on what seems to be Millikan's thesis that successful manifest. What did I say here? Okay. Yeah, so when it comes to what makes a difference between genuine ability and a mere disposition, it's the fact that the disposition was preceded by and is grounded by the previous, that same disposition. Gosh, I'm getting a little tongue-tied here. It's the fact that the disposition is now had because it was had previously, and that previous successes of the exercise of that disposition now ground its possession. So I guess in terms of the archery example, it's because you now have the ability to hit the target because you previously had a way of firing arrows at the target that was successful and sufficiently often, and your present disposition to shoot at the target in that way is grounded in the previous successes of that disposition. And when it comes to articulating substantive conditions with regard to the relevant etiology that grounds dispositions that constitute abilities, the material in the Good Thinking is a bit sparse, and so this is kind of reconstruction of what I felt like you were getting at in reference to Millikan's work. So X's disposition to F constitutes an ability to F, just in case the following conditions are satisfied. Pardon me, not just in case, only if the following conditions are satisfied. And the main condition to focus on is the base condition that X has the disposition to F in virtue of some etiological story involving X's past manifestations of the disposition, explaining one's current possession of the disposition. The other two cases, conditions we need to worry about. Okay, so here's what I take to be the puzzle. So in virtue of having a disposition on pretty standard accounts of dispositions, it's in virtue of having it, it's true that it's possible for you to manifest it. Right? So the idea of an unmanifestable disposition is a null category. What I take to follow from Millikan's thesis and my reconstruction of the relevant passage from Chris's book, Constituting Abilities, is that for any F, S can manifest the disposition to F without manifesting the ability, because the disposition that should constitute the ability hasn't been grounded appropriately. So S can manifest the disposition to know without manifesting an ability to know. So for some P, S can know that P without having an ability to know. All right, so that's part one. Part two, if S manifests the disposition to know, then one knows, right, by fact of manifestation. That premise might actually be an essential to the problem, but it seemed relevant when I wrote this. More relevant is this: if S knows, then S's knowledge constituting belief is justified, right, by KJ entailment. Oh, right, something Chris defends. If S's knowledge constituting belief is justified, then it's a product of an exercise of an ability to know, from which it follows that you cannot know P without exercising an ability to know. And then you just get a straightforward contradiction. Okay. So when I was puzzling over this, I was thinking, what kind of solution would do the least amount of damage to all the things Chris wants to and has defended? And I was left with this potential idea, right? So you reject Millikan's thesis and constituting abilities, and you allow for the simultaneous acquisition of a disposition to F and an ability to F, in virtue of that disposition to F being grounded in a disposition to do something else, probably something that's pretty close to Fing, but not quite. And then you can say that when it comes to some dispositions, like the disposition to know, the relevant etiology that grounds the disposition to know, in virtue of which it's an ability to know, is not a previous disposition to know, but rather it's a previous disposition to do something that's a whole lot like knowing light, knowing star, call it what you want. And then when the disposition to form beliefs in the relevant way is sufficiently well grounded by this disposition to know star, know light, eventually a disposition to know is born. And so when it comes to some dispositions, like the disposition to know, it can be had simultaneously. And so not preceded by, not grounded in a previous disposition to know. So I guess my general question for you, Chris, here is, how do you resolve this particular puzzle? Maybe it has nothing to do with my suggested potential solution. And I think that's all I have to say, so thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Paul, for your very thoughtful comments. And again, also to you for taking the time to actually read the book. So I'm gonna talk about sort of the two parts. So I think the first part being on the circular account of knowledge, leaving open the question of grounding, what metaphysically grounds knowledge, and the idea that circularity here is not an option. And then the second one, which is the sort of on the helpful side, which I think is great. So this is always the kind of comment that is very flattering and nice to hear. And so I'm going to say something about the first point first. And I think so what this does, the question of grounding, I think is sort of touches upon a really interesting methodological issue, which is the question as to what we can kind of expect from an epistemological theory, right? So what I want to start with in thinking about this is a distinction between two questions about grounding. One is a metaphysical question, and the other is an epistemological question, right? And I'm in full agreement that there is an interesting metaphysical question here. And what I'm a little less sure of is whether there's an interesting epistemological question here, i.e. something that we as epistemologists need to address. So let me try and elaborate. So when we look at your biconditional S knows that P if and only if, like, phi, if and only if and indeed because phi, right? Then of course, traditional epistemologists have tried to answer this, right? In terms of saying, well, justify true belief or whatnot. So this is something that people have done. But my thought is maybe that was a mistake, right? So I think for our epistemological purposes, the really interesting question is one about the direction of explanation, right? So if you have a question about the nature of knowledge, as knows that P if and only if and because phi, right? The kind of interesting, epistemologically interesting question, I think, is about the direction of explanation. So you unpack phi in such a way that phi has explanatory priority over S knows that P, right? And that's exactly what the traditionalists have been doing. Now, my view is that this is a sort of thing that we should abandon. And like, I mean, if you think that's right, then in a way, the virtue epistemological answer that you develop, right, in terms of abilities to know, that's also not going to help with this direction of explanation issue. Because for the direction of explanation, the circularity is going to be damaging, right? We can't explain knowledge in terms of abilities to know, at least not if we explain abilities to know in terms of, like, ways of getting you at knowledge or something like that, right? Something broadly reliabilist. Now that leaves open the metaphysical question, which is very much life. But I suspect that it's epistemologically not like, that interesting. I mean, or at least, like, the way that I see epistemology is as a normative discipline. And I think an answer to the purely metaphysical question, so where we sort of ditch ambitions about directions of explanation and so on, that's not going to shed any light on knowledge as a distinctively normative phenomenon, right? In a way in which, like, JTB analysis might, right? So that might shed light on the normativity of knowledge, and that it says, well, it's sort of to be understood in terms of this other normative thing which comes first, right? So my suggestion would be, or my attempt to deal with this issue is to say, well, as far as epistemology is concerned, we reach rock bottom in the same way, sort of once we hit the circle, in the same way as with chess and baseball, and maybe to sort of engage with your possibility necessity kind of case. I think in the same way in which, like, when we talk about possible worlds or something, we reach rock bottom, or for as far as our purposes of doing modal logic are concerned, right? So beyond that, we can have metaphysical interests, right? And these interests are, perfectly legitimate, but, like, as far as our logic is concerned, we can, like, rest content with the circle and leave the stuff to the metaphysicians, right? And I want to say maybe something like that is true in the epistemological case as well. So the circle, we're hitting rock bottom normatively, right? As with chess, right? What metaphysically grounds chess, who knows? And to say, well, there is an interesting question here, but, like, it's a sort of more of a question for metaphysicians than one for us epistemologists, at least us normative epistemologists, and that's how I see epistemology, right? And so one thing, so basically a thing that I mentioned in the book was this kind of idea that one might try and give a kind of Ramsey-Lewis style analysis, right? So you have the circle, and then you do a Ramsey sentence, right? You replace all the occurrences of knowledge and inquiry and so on by variables, and then you quantify, and then you have something that can be a kind of reductive but holistic analysis of knowledge, right? And as far as the grounding, metaphysical grounding is concerned, right, that might well be a viable response, even if you think, like, you know, for our epistemological purposes, like, you know, this kind of Ramsey sentence isn't really that interesting, because it, like, you know, we can't really understand what knowledge and understanding is, right? We need what knowledge and inquiry and so on is. In terms of that, in order to understand that, we need to know what the elements in the circle actually are, right? But as far as the grounding is concerned, that thing might lead the way to an answer, right? Whatever it is that satisfies this Ramsey sentence, right? But I think if you think of it in that way, then what you're saying is epistemologically not that interesting, right? So to say, well, that whatever satisfies this thing is what metaphysically grounds it, you know, we can say that, but we're not making progress in epistemology towards that, at least not at least so long as we're not offering it as a kind of analysis of knowledge, where we say, well, this is what knowledge really is, right? Where we would again sort of make a direction of analysis claim, right? Where this comes in the analysis of knowledge, of the nature of knowledge first. Okay, so those were the sorts of things that I thought on the first point. And the second, I think, yeah, there you also again put your finger on an important difficulty for accounts of ability that have a kind of etiological thing happening, right? So, I mean, or at least for ones that have that etiological thing and that want to hold that knowledge entails justified belief and explain that in terms of abilities, right? Because if abilities have this etiological thing, then it must be possible to manifest the disposition and not have the ability, and then it must be possible to have knowledge without ability, and so without justification. So then we get the kind of inconsistency that you point out, right? And your suggestion is to drop the idea it must be possible to manifest the disposition and not have the ability, and to allow that the two are acquired simultaneously. And that is pretty much what I've always kind of thought one should say about this kind of situation. And it seems kind of plausible. It seems that there can be cases where you acquire an ability without having done the thing that you're acquiring an ability to do successfully in the past, right? So for instance, you can learn how to fly a plane on a flight simulator, right? When you're in the flight simulator, you're not flying any planes, right? It's not like you've successfully flown planes in the past, but you acquire the ability to fly planes, right? So what happens is once you get it, you get the disposition and the ability at the same time, or like, you know, at least you're getting an ability without having a history of successful attempts or something like that. And lastly, so there's a reason why this is a kind of theoretical possibility on my view. Which is that on my view, abilities are kind of our properties of processes, right? They're not just dispositions, right? So you have a certain process, a way of doing things that counts as an ability to F when running that process disposes you to successfully F, right? And in the kind of case that you're interested in, right? What happens is that learning molds the process in such a way that you get to have the relevant disposition, right? So you're shooting in a varieties of ways, and as you practice shooting, right, your way of shooting gets molded in a way in which you it now has the disposition to allow you to hit the target, and so once you have this kind of view, you can see how it is possible that it might be that the two properties of having the disposition to something and being the ability to do that thing could become a property of the process at the same time. And so I'm very sympathetic to the sorts of things that you say, and hoping that I don't need to modify my view too much in order to be able to actually say the sorts of things that you think I should say. So thanks.
Okay, so Felipe, you're next.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks Concept and Federal University of Bahia for this invitation, and especially Chris for giving me the opportunity to discuss once again his work. And well, the book is a great book. I really enjoy it. Well, since I've been using parts of Chris' ideas in my work, so it was pretty easy for me to be convinced by most of the ideas of the book, which made my work here a little bit harder, but let's see. I have basically a few clarification questions, and also I'm interested to hear more about something that is not in the book, so I can understand a little bit more about the explanatory power of Chris' framework. I want to focus first on the idea of understanding. So first, you say that understanding basically requires truth. So my first question is if it's possible to understand, for example, false theories like flat earth theory or creationist, and this kind of theory that doesn't have any kind of truth at all, or if for you is it actually in fact understanding that is playing the role here, but the other thing. This is my first question. And the second one, I want to try to pressure a little bit more about the idea of the relation between understanding and knowledge. So I want to imagine this case. So let's say that I'm talking with a friend, and well, I do my blood exams, and I realize that I have high cholesterol. So my friend say, "Hey, high cholesterol is bad. You should go to a doctor." And then I go to the first doctor, and he say, "Well, probably you have high cholesterol because you eat a lot of fast food." And okay, so I go to another doctor, and he said, well, high cholesterol is bad because it means that you have high risk of heart disease. And then I go to another doctor, and he says, well, you should eat foods that lower your cholesterol and avoid foods that make your cholesterol high. So given that I get all these pieces of information from different people, I believe that by degrees of understanding and outright understanding, we could say that I have some kind of understanding here. But the thing is that one way of understanding the concept of understanding is by an internalist way, that we do something when you get understanding. And in the book, you said that we have to connect the dots. And my question here is, well, given this example, it looks like I didn't anything. I didn't connect any dots. I just got a lot of piece of information that by outright understanding, I would say, well, I have understanding. No, and it looks like a counterexample to your case, the scatterbrain case, because it's a case where you describe the subject getting information, pieces of information or knowledge for different people. And you say, well, even in this case, the subject didn't connect the dots. So my question here is, is my example a case of understanding, even though I didn't do anything, I didn't even connect any dots, or is not a case of understanding, meaning that why is not a case of understanding? So if my case here is a case of understanding, we should review your example, the scattered brain case. No, so this is my two questions about understanding. So I guess it's not actually objections, but more clarification questions. And my questions about what is not in the book, what I want to ask is, well, the first one is maybe connect with Giada point about the nature inquiry. That is there any space for responsibility here when you talk about inquiry? Like we can say that an effective inquiry is when we get knowledge or understanding, but is there any space for talking about responsible inquiry, or there's no space for responsibility here? This is my first question. And the second one is just a curiosity. What kind of move is suspension of judgment? Because some people talk about suspension of judgment, meaning that when we suspend judgment, it just means that the inquiry is open. So we inquiring more. And other people say, no, suspension of judgment is a kind of the end of inquiry. So I want to know about suspension of judgment, and also what do you think about degrees of belief in your framework? So, because if belief means that I'm closing inquiry, so for example, if someone asks me, do you think Trump will be impeached? I can say, well, I kind of believe, I mean, I can bet, I know, $10 that he will be impeached. So it kind of means that I have some kind of degrees of belief, but it doesn't mean that I close the inquiry for me properly. So how do what can you say about degree of belief? So these are my questions. It's pretty short question. It's not actually objections, but I think that with these we can have a better idea of the explanatory power of your framework, because I do believe that it has a better explanatory power than the competitions like virtual epistemology. So I think it's a great job you did here. And well, that's it. Thank you once again.
All right, thank you so much, Felipe, for your very thoughtful comments. Thanks for taking the time to read the book. Okay, so there is a lot of substance here to cover, especially the questions at the end. I'm going to start with your questions about understanding in the beginning. So you're asking about the relation between understanding and truth, and in particular, how it's possible or whether it's possible to understand false theories such as creationism and so on. And so I think the way that I like to think about this stuff is, so understanding is sort of involves knowledge, right? And so something that's factive, but it involves knowledge about the phenomenon understood, right? And now we have to be careful about specifying what exactly the phenomenon is that we're understanding, right? So one phenomenon that we might try to understand is like, the origins of humans, right? And I don't think you can understand the origins of humanity through creationism, right? Because creationism is like, it's just too far off. There's too little knowledge to be gained through creationism to understand the origins of humanity, right? But here's a different phenomenon, the theory of creationism, that's a phenomenon we can ask about, and there are, like, you know, facts about it, and those facts we can understand. I mean, we can know, and so we can understand quite well, right? So it's possible, on my view, to understand creationism, right, as in the theory of creationism, really quite well. I mean, I suspect that there are many people who understand the theory of creationism better than the origins of humanity, because it's, you know, to begin with, considerably less complex of a question, right? So one thing that's really important to keep remain clear about, is what exactly the object of understanding is, right? Is it a phenomenon out there in the world, or is it a theory? So that's one thing. Another kind of related question that comes up is about, like, you know, understanding the world through false theories, idealization, the ideal gas law, and this kind of stuff, right? And there, the important observation, from as far as my view is concerned, is to understand a phenomenon, even when you understand it through a theory about that phenomenon, does not require you to know the true theory of that phenomenon. That theory doesn't have to be true, right? All it needs to do is to, like, you know, get you close enough to knowledge, right? I mean, and presumably better so than some other views, and so on, right? So I think that a lot of this trades on this kind of implicit view that people who think that understanding is knowledge have to sign up to the idea that when you understand a phenomenon through a theory, what that means is that you got to know the theory to be true, but theory is false, so you can't know it to be true, so you can't understand, you know, the world through these sorts of theories. But that's not a view. It's compatible with my view that, you know, our knowledge of the ideal gas law gives us more knowledge about how, you know, gas particles behave, right, in the world out there, and as a result advances our understanding of the behavior of gases, right? So that's a possibility in my view. Okay, the relation between understanding and knowledge. So here we have the case of the person with high cholesterol and going to a bunch of different doctors who tells them a bunch of different things about cholesterol and, you know, the role of it plays in your life, and so on. And the thought is, your thought is, this person now understands you know, the role cholesterol has in your life, let's say, better than before. And maybe we can even say that person understands the role of cholesterol in your life outright. Okay, and at the same time, it looks as though that person hasn't made any connections. So so doesn't the person count as not understanding on my view? Okay, so I mean, so one thing that's interesting about let's say noteworthy about my view is that you know, it starts from a kind of the maximum point, right? So maximum understanding is maximally systematic knowledge, right? And then you have degrees of understanding in terms of approximations to that, right? And so the scatterbrain case, right, is one where somebody knows everything there's to know, but at the same time, it doesn't look as though they understand everything there is to understand as well as it can be understood, right? So that's the kind of case that goes against the reduction of understanding to knowledge. So in order to have maximal understanding, at least, you need to do more. You need to connect the dots, right? Now, that's the main purpose. Now, there is an additional claim about that case, which is that the scatterbrain doesn't understand very much at all about the world because all that knowledge is kind of disconnected, right? Now, does it follow that the scatterbrain doesn't understand anything at all? I mean, my view just doesn't say very much about that. And one reason for that is that I don't specify whether there is a minimal threshold, really. I mean, I suspect, yes, that there is. I mean, you gotta have, like, you know, if you only know one thing, right, about something, do you understand it any better as if you didn't know that one thing? I don't know, like, you know, it's not so clear that you do to me. But in principle, even, like, you know, leaving that aside, so my view leaves open that there is no minimal threshold, right? So it's certainly compatible with my view that the person in the scatterbrain case understands the world better before he acquired all that knowledge than before, right? It's just that he understands it considerably worse than some people who know less stuff, but, like, you know, have connected the dots in the right way, right? I mean, that seems plausible to me at any rate. And like, you know, I mean, when I started out thinking about understanding, I had the kind of view that you seem to be attracted to, where the connecting the dots doesn't really matter so much. And then, you know, people have pressed these objections against me, the sort of scatterbrain kind of objections, and that has made me change my mind, right? But it's possible that he understands it better, like, you know, and then to some extent it seems plausible, right? It seems plausible now that he knows more about the world than before. He approximates maximal understanding more closely, so he understands it better, right? And the same is true of your case of the patient, I think, right? So he knows now more about the role cholesterol plays in your life after you've kind of got this advice from these doctors than you did before. So, you know, to the extent that you advance in the direction of maximally systematic knowledge, you advance in your degree of understanding, right? So I think that's something that we can have. And then the question about outright attributions of understanding, I mean, that is, like, you know, so there we need, in order to assess this properly, we need more information. I mean, we need to know what's happening at the context, right? In principle, I can, again, like, you know, see that there might be contexts in which an attribution comes out true, right? I mean, you can think of cases where we talk about primary school children and like, you know, they, you know, answer correctly a multiple choice, you know, exam about, or several of them about, like, you know, the layers of the ocean, right? And now we might want to say that the ones that do answer them correctly, they understand, like, you know, the layers of the ocean, and the other ones who don't, they don't, right? Even though maybe they don't have a lot of connected stuff, right? It's just that now we have a context where we set the threshold extremely low, right? I mean, so can we create a context where the threshold is so low that our patient comes out as understanding stuff? Maybe that's possible, right? Because, like, you know, if we put him next to people who like, you know, haven't even heard of cholesterol, like, you know, they aren't even acquainted with the word, then we might say, oh yeah, this guy, he understands about cholesterol. Go talk to him, or something like that, right? So that's how I would try and deal with that kind of case. Okay, now we have 3 questions, one about the role of responsibility in inquiry, one about nature of suspension in inquiry, and one about degrees of beliefs. These are fascinating questions. In fact, I'm working on a follow-up book that is kind of on responsibility and defeat, right? I mean, basically, are there questions that we should ask? epistemically, right? And I want to say yes, right? I mean, certain, like if you're a doctor, you should, like, be on top of recent developments in your field. So there are certain questions about what happened in your field that you should ask. If you don't ask those questions, then you violate, some epistemic norms, and that might result in defeat and so on. Even though, like, your evidence supports that P, you believe that P might end up defeated. So that's something that I'm working on at the moment, right? So I think in a nutshell, the answer is yes, there is space for this. Working it out is something that I'm in the business of doing, at least partially. Like, it's only a very limited treatment of that. Suspension of judgment, I think is also a really fascinating kind of question, right? I mean, I really haven't thought about that very systematically yet. What I think I would want to say is that it's another type of move in inquiry. If you think of belief as a move in inquiry, so is suspension, right? So that then one might think, given the way that the view works, there should be a constitutive aim of inquiry, right? So maybe it's something like when you can't know either way, right? I mean, suspension is successful when you can't know or justifiable belief or something like that either way. This is sort of shooting from the hip, like, stuff that I'm interested in thinking about in the future. Once I'm hopefully done with this next book, it could be perhaps the one after that. And then the question about degrees of belief, yeah, that's a very big question. It's like, I mean, degrees of belief is something that I tend to shy away from as much as possible. I think that, like, how sort of outright belief and degrees of belief, how they relate to one another, is like a really hard question in epistemology. I mean, how they relate to each other normatively and so on is a really hard question. Hopefully one day I'll be able to say something about it, but at the moment, like, it's something that's on the shelf as stuff, like, I mean, I'd like to think about it at some point, but, I'm kind of prioritizing other stuff because, this is very hard, also because the degree of belief stuff tends to get very formal very quickly, and then you need to sort of engage with all this formal stuff, and, like, I mean, I prefer other things. So hopefully at some point I'll be able to say something more informative about that. But for now, I'm going to say, I don't really have anything particularly good to say about degrees of belief at the moment. But thanks again to all three of you for your fantastic comments and for this really excellent exchange. Thanks.
Okay, since we're already over our 2-hour mark, I suggest that we wrap up. So thank you everyone for participating. And of course, special thanks to Chris for giving us the opportunity to engage with your work in this fun and interactive way. If you would like to buy Christoph's forthcoming book, it should be published this spring by Oxford University Press. And I believe it's already available to pre-order. So we will definitely link to that in the description. And if you would like to stay up to date with future installments of Philosopher Meets Critics or other events organized by Concept, you can visit us at concept-phil.de, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Figments of the Brain, where you can also view previous installments of Philosopher Meets Critics. So with that said, once again, thanks everyone for participating, and thank you for watching.